Well, good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to tonight's event. Welcome to the New Zealand Initiative. Pleasure to have you all here. My name is Oliver Hart. I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to our event, and especially to welcome our guest speaker, Adam Creighton. Now, the topic of tonight's event is Australia is still the lucky country, with a big question mark. We, of course, are very interested in Australian affairs here because of our important trade links with Australia, but not least, of course, because we have 40,000 kiwis net a year who are making the move across the Tasman because they expect a better life in Australia, perhaps better job opportunities, the country where milk and honey flow. But as we're going to hear tonight, perhaps not all is well in Australia. And Adam Creighton is extremely well placed to give us an overview of the Australian economy and the challenges that are facing the Australians, because Adam is the economics correspondent at the Australian and he covers these issues on a daily basis. But I'm also pleased to say that we have a common past, because we spent about a year working together at the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney and even co-authored a few pieces and reports together, and therefore it's a great pleasure for me to welcome my old friend Adam to New Zealand. Before working for the Australian, he, as I mentioned, worked at the Centre for Independent Studies in the Economics Research Program in Sydney. But before that, he worked for a while as Tony Abbott's economics advisor. And dare I say that I think he would really benefit from you these days after his last announcements on foreign direct investment in Australia. But his main background is really journalism. He spent about half a year with the Economist in London, and he's an incredibly prolific writer, and I think the Australian greatly benefits from your contributions, and we're extremely privileged to have you here tonight. So without further ado, welcome Adam Creighton. We look forward to your speech.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver. It's great to be here. It's my first time in New Zealand since 2004. Wellington certainly changed since then. It's much busier now, and I'm very grateful that the weather has been so nice as well. What a beautiful weekend. It seems Oliver's doing a fantastic job here with this new think tank, so I also want to give him credit for that. So as I say, the last time I was in New Zealand was in Wellington. That was 8 years ago. It was to also give a talk, actually. It seems every time I come to Wellington I'm giving a talk. It was to present my honours thesis. It was about how great currency unions were, and what a great experiment currency union had been. So anyway, I'm not going to talk about that today. And I know the Productivity Commission of both countries rejected the idea just last week, and as did Bill English this afternoon when I interviewed him, and he said, never ever, basically. Anyway, so yeah, the title is The Lucky Country, and that phrase comes from a book that was written by Donald Horne in 1964, an Australian author. He wrote a book called The Lucky Country. The phrase has given birth to the title of many speeches in Australia since then. Indeed, the Reserve Bank Governor, the Australian Reserve Bank Governor Glenn Stevens, only 2 months ago gave a speech that was called The Lucky Country. The phrase has become a reminder of Australia's natural beauty, its isolation from the wars and disputes that animate too much of the world, and the country's substantial wealth as well. And of course, the relentless flow of dreary economic news out of the United States and Europe has only reinforced that view, I think, recently. But most Australians don't realise that the phrase and the title of Horne's book, they came from the opening sentence of the last chapter, which was, Australia is a lucky country run by second-rate people who share its luck. So, so the book, in fact, was at least as critical of Australia as it was complimentary. Horne thought much of Australia's material success was a result of luck, and its cultural life was insular and parochial. Horne hoped that rather than simply being a lucky country, Australia might one day be a clever country too. Horne passed away in 2005, and he would probably have been impressed with the greater sophistication of Australia's cultural life, at least, that inevitably comes with a much bigger population. So in 1964, Australia was almost entirely Caucasian, and it had a population of just over 11 million, which is less than half of what it has now. But he might also be sceptical that he might still be sceptical that Australia's economic good fortune, especially in its very recent history, has much to do with anything apart from luck, and certainly very little to do with the wisdom of its political masters. So Australia's recent economic performance has been remarkable. The country has just entered its 21st year of uninterrupted economic growth. The economy grew at 3.7% over the year to June, about 3 times the pace of the United States. The most recent jobs data showed the unemployment rate had fallen to 5.1%, and that's where the rate has been for many months now. The years of strong growth have boosted Australia's economy to the point where it is now the 13th largest in the world. It is on the precipice of edging out Spain for the 12th position, a country with twice as many people. Per head, Australia is the 7th richest country in the world now, long having surpassed the United States and certainly Great Britain. If countries with populations of less than 5 million are excluded, then Australia is third behind Switzerland and Denmark. Of course, much of this acceleration has occurred over the last 10 years. Since 2005, the country's real national income has grown by more than 20% and income per capita by more than 7%. But I'm sure you're also aware that since about that same time, Australia has enjoyed a massive increase in its export prices. It's more easy to comprehend the size of this increase by actually talking about the price of particular commodities. So the price of iron ore, for instance, Australia's largest export, has increased from around $20 or $30 a tonne in the early part of the last decade to almost $180 a tonne late last year. The price has fallen since then to around $100 a tonne, but as you can see, it's still extremely high. The second largest export of Australia, coal, is now trading around $90 a tonne, and it was about $20 a tonne also in the last decade. It's important to remember that Australia is no stranger to resource booms. Indeed, when Donald Horne was writing in the 1960s, a resource boom was just getting underway, partly as a result of rapid advancement of the Japanese economy at that time. Mining investment rose from about 0.5% of GDP in the early 1960s to about 3% in the early 1970s. Compare that to more recent times, where resource investment is planned to peak this financial year at 9% of GDP, as opposed to 3% in the 1970s. And investment related to resources is now half of that total. But of course, this time it's China that is hoovering up Australia's resources, not Japan. It overtook Japan as Australia's largest trade partner only a few years ago. Given these powerful price incentives, it's perhaps no surprise that there are $1 trillion worth of investment projects that are either underway in Australia now or are soon going to begin. 98 of these, in fact, worth more than $250 billion, are under construction right now. Mining profits in 2002 were 16% of total corporate profits. Now they are 31%, 10 years later. And of course, iron ore, coal and gas now make up around half of Australia's exports. This has had a huge transformation on the economy internally. Practically all of Australia's employment growth in the past few years has taken place in Queensland and Western Australia. In 2002, the mining sector employed 80,000 Australians. 10 years later, it employs almost 300,000. But of course, for all the talk of mining jobs, it's important to remember that they only contribute 2.5% of total jobs in Australia, even at this mining boom peak. Manufacturing, retail and tourism, which together employ far more people, have been, of course, complaining because of the high Australian dollar, and I understand this is also an issue here. The Australian dollar has been permanently perched above $1 for most of the past few years. Excuse me. But so far, at least, the rapid growth in the mining sector has managed to offset job losses in the manufacturing and retail sectors. In fact, the phrase two-speed economy in Australia has become almost as well known. In fact, I'd probably say more well known now than the phrase the lucky country itself. The phrase, though, is associated with economic bad news generally in the press, and it's certainly a phrase that I kind of use in some of my news articles, and indeed lots of journalists do use the phrase. The other ones are also patchwork economy. That's the new favourite. But anyway, they are generally associated with bad news. But basically, when I think Australia's been extremely lucky, I think the situation would be far, far worse if we didn't have the so-called two-speed economy. We can't observe the counterfactual, but I think it's difficult to see how, without the mining boom, Australia's performance over the past few decades will be anything like it's been. So I think Australia remains a lucky country, but I also think that luck will run out at some point, and that Australia is really avoiding having to make some difficult choices now, which I'll get to soon. Australia is in its fourth or fifth resources boom, depending on how it's defined, since gold was first struck in Victoria in the 1850s. And of course, they all have one thing in common: they end, and they've all typically ended with high inflation and a recession. Indeed, the chief economist of Deutsche Bank in Sydney has recently forecast that there might be a recession in Australia at the end of next year. That is, if the commodity prices continue to fall at the same rate. And there are already signs that the current boom is beginning to sputter. So the price of iron ore, as I mentioned earlier, has fallen fairly dramatically since the beginning of the year. A number of major resource projects are being shelved. Most prominently, the $28 billion Olympic Dam project in South Australia, which is one of the BHP's projects. And there's also the rising costs in Australia, as Gina Reinhardt said recently. She's Australia's richest woman and I guess the most famous resource magnate now. She pointed out that Australia had become a very expensive country to do business in, and that she already thought that projects were going overseas because of the high costs. And the costs not just in terms of taxes, but also regulation, red and green tape, and so forth. The Australian government's tax revenues are falling short of the budget estimates, and some people are now saying around the traps that the mid-year budget update, which generally occurs around November in Australia, will actually be occurring early, because the situation is so bad that the government wants to get out of the way before it has to downgrade its revenue even further. And then, of course, China also appears to be sputtering as well. The government's official forecast of 7.5% growth in China now looks as though it might be too optimistic. And of course, in 5 years' time, the Chinese workforce actually starts to shrink because of the impact of the one-child policy. So now I'd like to say that I think this is a wasted opportunity in Australia. I think Australian politicians are not necessarily worse or better than in other countries, but they've wasted a great opportunity to reform Australia's economy. Of course, reform is always difficult, but I think the spectre of economic crises in the United States and Europe provide a powerful and useful backdrop for any politician who wants to make the case that government in the West has become too large. Politicians in Australia frequently point to the OECD comparisons that cast Australia in a very favourable light, especially in the case of public debt. Australia's public debt is actually quite low in net terms. But of course the point should be rather that Australia might end up in the same situation, and that Europe and the United States are merely a few decades, or perhaps one, in front of Australia. So the first issue that I want to talk about is the size of government. Basically, that the government in Australia has become too large. So for instance, just think about this. In the grip of an unprecedented resource boom, the largest in Australian history, there hasn't been a single budget surplus at state or federal level of any note. And this is certainly the case at the federal level, where the government is currently running a very large deficit. And of course, Australia's political debate remains completely oblivious to the possibility that global woes are some sort of harbinger of Australia's future. Labor and Liberal politicians on both sides of the spectrum blithely propose additions and expansions to Australia's welfare state. These include a new national disability insurance scheme, an enhanced paid parental leave scheme, a new publicly funded dental scheme, higher dole payments, and more funding for public schools. And this is just in the past, say, 6 months. So if I just mention Keynes himself said in the 1930s that the taxation at 25% of GDP would be the maximum tolerable proportion for any country. And yet, of course, the measure in Australia now is about 35% of GDP, and of course, much higher in the rest of the world. It's grown about sixfold since the beginning of the last century. And this is what I was going to tell you about Australia's welfare state. No, not quite yet, but I'll get to that in a minute. And of course, as many of you know, when government expands beyond its natural limits, it saps and distorts economic growth, it curbs productivity, it dulls entrepreneurship and the incentive to work, and of course it sucks smart people into jobs which may not have much inherent value. This is certainly happening in Australia, and it's mainly happening because of the public subsidy of health and education, which of course, like here and like in most Western countries, are growing extremely rapidly. We talk a lot about the mining boom, but it's important to know that almost 1 in 3 new jobs in Australia since 2002 have been in the health and education sectors. And of course, these are public sectors. The public service more generally continues to grow in Australia. So since 1930, the number of public servants has grown from 1 in every 14 to 1 in every 12 people. And you would think that there might be some sort of efficiencies in public administration, some economies of scale, especially with the dramatic increase in technology since then. So right now, there's a huge debate in Australia about the supposedly savage cuts of the Queensland government, the new Queensland government of Campbell Newman. He's announced that he'll retrench 14,000 people, which of course sounds a very large figure. But it's important to understand rather, that Queensland's public service grew at twice the rate of the state's population over the past 5 years, and added 22,000 staff in 5 years. The public service of New South Wales is around 395,000 people, by far the largest in Australia. And of course that does include all the police and doctors and nurses and so forth, and school teachers, But nevertheless, it's a dramatically large figure, and it grows by about 5,000 every year. And it's worth remembering in that light that the new Premier, Barry O'Farrell, who has the largest majority in the history of New South Wales, going back to 1851, has only been willing to trim it by 10,000 over 4 years. And that has, of course, prompted strike action. Of course, beyond spending and the payroll of Australia's levels of government, it's important to recognise the sheer torrent of legislation as well, which has grown from a few hundred pages a year in the 1950s, and this is just the federal level, to 7,160 pages of new legislation last year. And of course the state parliaments, which are also their own little governments in themselves, are also churning out laws at similar rates. And this is what I just wanted to run through. I thought you might find this entertaining to consider some of Australia's various middle class welfare measures, which I understand from talking to some staffers here is nowhere near as bad here yet. So the second biggest item in Australia's budget is middle class welfare or family payments. Some of these you've probably heard of. So we have a baby bonus, right, and that is paid to people who earn up to $150,000 a year. That is $5,000 per child, and of course if you have twins, $10,000. It is not taxed, right? But of course that is just the tip of the iceberg. That is absolutely nothing. That is just the beginning. We also have this thing called family tax benefit aid. Now the word tax is in there because it used to actually be related to paying tax, and of course that was severed in the mid-2000s. Now it is basically just a welfare transfer. It has absolutely nothing to do with the tax system at all. Now people get family tax benefit aid if they have one child on incomes up to $101,000 a year. These are all Australian dollars, obviously. If you have 2 teenage children and 1 child, you get it up to $140,000 a year. Now, a family income of $140,000 a year in Australia is probably putting someone at the top 10 percentage points of income, of household income. So, these are people who are 90% richer than other households are getting welfare. What are the amounts, you ask? So for a child aged less than 15, it's $170 a fortnight. For a teenager, it's $220 a fortnight. Now then there's a family tax benefit there. This is my personal favourite because this was basically introduced by the Howard government, and of course they would never admit this, but it was basically to encourage women to stay home and look after the kids. So the way it works is this. There's no means test on the income of the primary earner, which is generally the man. They can earn up to $150,000 a year, right, before it even begins to start to cut out, right? So that obviously covers almost all the population, basically. I mean, very, very few people earn more than that amount of money. Now, it starts to cut out if the female, or the secondary earner, earns more than $5,000 a year, and so it cuts out entirely when she's earning $25,600 a year. So basically, and I find this absolutely staggering, so a family with 1 child can be earning $176,000 a year and still be getting welfare. Quite breathtaking. quite breathtaking. Now, of course, that doesn't include a whole host of other things, like the childcare rebate, which is not even means tested. That is a flat $7,500 a year per child. But of course, that's not the only childcare support. There's also another one which is means tested, and that is $200 a week. And that is even if the woman chooses to stay home. So if she chooses to stay home, then she gets $200 a week to send the kid to childcare. Actually, I did have a laugh because I went on the website. I just got some of these facts this afternoon because Luke encouraged me to kind of go through some of the details of this. And it said we are experiencing very high demand for services. That was actually a comment on the website. I just thought that was kind of funny. So anyway, so after all that, there's a whole other layer, and it's just been started. So obviously, just as revenues are starting to fall off, we've got a whole new support program. It's called the School Kids Bonus. Now, this is very, very funny. It's an invention of the Gillard government, of course, extremely important, very necessary. So that basically is conversion of an old sort of tax write-off, basically, for all your violin lessons and so forth that the Howard government introduced. So they introduced this thing called the education tax refund, whereby you could keep your receipts and anything even vaguely related to education, your violin lessons, books, whatever, you could save them up and then you could write it off against your tax. The Gillard government was getting quite upset about this because it was quite complicated and people weren't actually taking advantage of it. And of course it was mainly poor families that weren't because they weren't as familiar with the tax system. So anyway, so now they've converted it to just a bonus. So now it's just paid whether you use it or not. So basically for every primary school kid now, there's $410 a year, once a year, just a one-off payment. And it's $820 for high school students. So that is on top of all the other stuff. And then of course I just wrote down, I mean there are just so many, it's really, I mean you really need a PhD to understand the Australian welfare system. There's an isolated child scheme, care allowance, there's dad and partner pay support, there's a double orphan pension, there's a helping young parents scheme, there's the paid parental leave scheme, there's parenting payment, there's rent assistance, there's single income family support, oh there's a telephone allowance, I only just found out this one. There is a telephone allowance of $40 a quarter if you're eligible for family tax benefit A, it's basically to help you get on the internet. I mean, you think after all the other welfare that there might be enough for the telephone. You think that. And of course there's transitional farm family pay. Whatever, I mean, I didn't have time to look at all that, but I mean it is actually mind-blowing. So it's just out of control. Anyway, back to, so that's just all in the field of the explosion of government in Australia and how it's, you know,
you have to live in Australia to get these benefits.
No, it's completely out of control, and also completely disgusting. Actually, it's completely corrupted Australian society. I think we had recently. I mean, I think the government realises that revenues are going to fall off, and so recently it decided to freeze. I think it was the budget this year or the budget last year. I can't quite remember. They decided to freeze the 150 grand cut-off for family tax benefit A, so it just wouldn't index. Right? Because it saves a huge amount when you don't index it, because just naturally things going up. And there was huge outcry. Indeed, the Daily Telegraph, the Sydney tabloid, which was extremely strange, really. They basically attacked the government for saying that people on 155 grand were rich. When I mean they are rich, but they kind of said, you know, kind of saying, you know, that it was outrageous for the government to say they were. And so you had on the front page of the Telegraph, you had this family, and they were on 155 grand, and they were going to miss out because it wasn't going to be indexed into their, you know, so they'd miss out. And it listed all their expenses, and they were there saying that they couldn't believe it, and they needed support, and it was outrageous. And so, I mean, that's a tabloid. So it's an example of how much it's completely corrupted Australia. Now, I'll be brief so we can ask so you can ask questions. But the second thing I thought we've really missed in Australia is a serious discussion about the economics of the financial services industry. Of course, there was no financial crisis in Australia. So because of that, it's become very fashionable in Australia to say that our regulators were very good, and our banks were better managed, they were smarter, etc., etc. So a lot of patting ourselves on our back there. Now, I think it's good to see regulators overseas and governments in general are trying to grapple with the idea of implicit guarantees, you know, the too big to fail phenomenon. It's not talked about at all in Australia. I tried to calculate for an article recently, and it was kind of well read. I just tried to conservatively calculate what the implicit guarantee was for Australia's four major banks as an annual flow, and basically it's between $2 and $7 billion a year, which is about a quarter of their profits. So you know, you can reasonably say that a quarter of their profits really are provided by taxpayers unwittingly. It's extremely difficult issue to deal with because, you know, what do you do? And I don't have an answer. But at least other countries are talking about it, not in Australia, not talking about it at all. Thirdly, I think Australia needs a much bigger population. This is what we don't talk about at all. I mean, Adam Smith once said the most decisive mark of the prosperity of any country is the increase in the number of inhabitants. Well, that was in 1776, and that has certainly changed since then. So, I think Kevin Rudd said in the beginning of 2010, he made the mistake on television of saying that he supported a big Australia of 35 million people by 2050. Anyway, he was castigated for it, absolutely castigated for it, and only 4 months later lost his job. It wasn't solely for that, but certainly the press went hysterical. In contrast, I think that we should embark on another great wave of immigration, like we had in the late 19th century and also after the Second World War. I mean, we hear in Australia constantly people complain about, you know, the bad public transport, that the cost of living is too great, and that Australian industry is not especially inventive. And certainly there is truth to all of these, but in my view there's a failure to recognise that a lot of these problems stem from Australia's too small population. I mean, it's all very well, I mean, it is much larger than New Zealand, but really Australia is just still 6 colonies, really. There are huge distances between the populations still. So it's very hard to get the economies of scale from a country with, you know, 23 million people. I mean, it's not the size of Spain, it's very, very big. And of course, all of the economic theory suggests that, you know, denser, larger cities are more creative and more likely to harness new ideas, etc. So I really think, and of course, since the GFC, Australia's population growth rate has actually fallen quite significantly, from 2% to about 1.4%. And I think of all times to have a new migration program now is perfect because we have in the United States and Europe, we have lots of young, educated young people who can't get jobs. And I think it's much more sensible for them to be in Australia than over there. But anyway, that's a minority view. I'll certainly leave it there and hopefully you have some questions.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you gave us plenty to talk about, so we would like to ask the first question. Yes, please.
Cam Calder, do you see any tensions between a drive for greater population and security of potable water in Australia?
Well, I don't know much about potable water,
Drinkable.
but certainly, you know, the anti-population debate is all about resources, and especially things like water. I mean, it's true Australia is a very parched country, and we don't have the natural supplies of other countries. But I still think that that argument is massively overplayed. Indeed, they built a hugely expensive desalination plant in New South Wales recently, which is still not being used. And I think they built one in Perth as well, and it's all kind of on the back of, we're going to run out of water any second now, and it just doesn't happen. And in fact, you know, there was a very bad drought in Australia until about until about 2009, but now it's broken. It's been raining heaps ever since. So, and so a lot of those people now, they're kind of embarrassed because we have this new infrastructure, it's not being used. But certainly it's true to say, as you observe, that you know, the water supply issue is what drives the anti-population debate. I just don't think it's a valid argument.
Just, we had on the 2025 task force the fifth person along the top row, Judith Sloan, and she argued strongly and just purely on economic grounds that immigration brought benefits from the immigrants, but not for the pre-existing local population. But she wasn't arguing water; she was arguing sort of the cost of providing housing and infrastructure and the like. On the other hand, we had another Australian, Wolfgang Kasper, who had argued the opposite in the Business Roundtable paper. Is it still a good conversation, or is it largely won by Judith's side at the moment?
I think it has been won by Judith. I mean, Judith's kind of my boss, so I can't but I mean, I would say that she's wrong on that, at least in the very long term. I mean, sure, there are short and medium-term costs of having to build infrastructure.
It is quite a short run.
But I think in the long run, I mean, yeah, take the United States. I mean, someone reminded me recently that maybe it was after the First World War they had a completely open borders policy for a while, and because population went from 100 million to 200 million or something in a pretty short space of time. But I mean, you couldn't seriously argue that impoverished the United States in any way. And I would make the same argument with Australia. I mean, indeed, I did some research. Well, as much research as journalists do, googling and reading some old books. And anyway, there were people in the late 19th century, Americans actually, coming to Australia, coming to Victoria in particular, and saying, gosh, this country's incredible, it's going to have a population of 100 million in 100 years, clearly. It's a huge country, it's got so much wealth, and it's going to rival the United States. This is what some people are saying. And I mean, look what happened. I mean, it's kind of a joke, really. So, it's an interesting contrast. But yeah, look, I think Judith has won the argument. I would agree with Wolfgang.
I mean, we've heard in New Zealand for many years that, you know, Australian macroeconomic reform has been superior to New Zealand's, and that the mining industry's impact on the Australian economy is not that great, actually. Which both of those things seem to be the opposite to what you're saying tonight.
Well, no, I mean, I think the mining has not had the employment impact that lots of people think, but it still is only 2.5% of the workforce. It's very, very low. Even though it's grown from a very small amount, it's still only 2.5%. But I think it's had huge impact on the rest of the economy because it's basically pushed up the Australian dollar, and that affects everyone across Australia. And that's had massive impacts on the ability to import machinery, to buy imported consumption goods. I mean, if it hadn't have been for that mining boom, I think the Australian dollar would be a lot lower, and therefore the rest of the economy would be structuring itself very differently. And as for the microeconomic reform, I mean, I think well, I mean, I can't speak for New Zealand, but my sense is that it's really stalled in Australia in the past kind of 10, 15 years. Basically, nothing's happening because we haven't had to do anything. There's just been all this income from overseas. I think New Zealand is almost, you know, I mean, in a reform sense, in a better position because it's going to be forced to do things. It's going to be forced to make changes before we are. And it doesn't seem that the welfare state here has gone anywhere near out of control like ours has. It's just completely bonkers. But I think there's going to be a lot of pain in Australia in the next few years when the revenues start to fall off and governments have to start to pare back some of this stuff. There's going to be a huge backlash, you know, from people who are used to it. So, yeah.
Perhaps to talk about the Australian dollar for a second, there are more and more voices calling for debasement of the Australian dollar because of the high exchange rate. And just today there was an article by Alan Cole actually in Business Spectator calling for just that. Now, Alan Cole is another of your colleagues at the News Limited. But how do you see the Australian dollar going? Is it likely that the Reserve Bank of Australia is going to cut interest rates in the next years by 1%, as Alan Cole actually suggests today?
No, well, I mean, 1% is actually priced into the market. I mean, basically, financial market trading is based on last week was 85 basis points of cuts over the next 12 months, which would bring interest rates in Australia to about 2.5%, at least official interest rates.
But would it actually have an impact on the exchange rate?
Well, the last cuts have had absolutely no impact at all. I mean, they cut twice this year, over 75 basis points in total. And before those cuts, everyone was very excited, well, at least the manufacturers and so forth were very excited this was going to bring the dollar down. Of course it didn't, and in fact the dollar is higher now than it was then. I think, you know, small central banks like Australia's and especially New Zealand's really have no hope of controlling their own currency. Unless they want to, you know, do a Swiss type solution and basically print vast amounts of it and just hand it out, which is fine. But I mean, but then on the downside, you know, in the future when people don't want it anymore, then they can't reverse it. You know, I mean, it's completely costless for a central bank to create its own currency. It can do that forever. Right? But the reverse situation, it can't. So I think it's got to be very careful. But also, I mean, I don't think it is a problem anyway. I mean, I just think Australia's having a high currency makes Australians rich. I mean, it's amazing going overseas now. I just feel so wealthy. Just buying. That's true. I think it's the only way that ordinary people get to benefit from the mining boom is because of the high currency. They don't get to benefit any other way.
I can't remember the exact details, but late 2008, I think, in response to a global financial crisis, the Australian government gave out reasonably generous payments, I think, to people on, you know, like superannuitants and to families.
Yep, that's
Did
true.
you think that was the right thing to do?
Yeah, so there were two stimulus packages. There was one in late 08 that you're talking about, and that was October. That was when things were really scary. And yes, they did give lump sums to pensioners, I think, and maybe the unemployed or people that were likely to spend the money. And they also guaranteed all banks' liabilities basically at the same time. Look, I mean, I don't know. I mean, things were pretty scary back then. I mean, I worked at the RBA at the time in October, just in a really junior capacity. And I remember thinking, gosh, I'm glad I've got a government job because I can't get sacked and it's great. And, you know, it was really, really that scary. But then, you know, things kind of, it was scary, but, you know, the crisis was over by, I think, early 2009. Of course, you know, growth really slumped around the world, but the actual crisis period was over, I thought. But of course, then the Rudd government enacted the second biggest stimulus package in the world. This was in April 2009, 4 times the size of what happened in October 2008. It was $43 billion versus $10.6 billion. It was all borrowed money. It was all borrowed at about 6% per annum, because at the time that's what the Australian government borrowed at. It's about 3.5 now, which is another story. But it was about 6% per annum, all borrowed at that rate, and it was just handouts of checks, basically $900 to everyone who paid tax. That was about $13 billion, I think, that, and the rest of it was another 13 or I don't know, 13 to 20 on school halls. Very, very bizarre. But it was called Building on Education Revolution. Basically, every school got a new hall. So, even if the school didn't want a hall, they wanted air That's true. If they wanted air conditioning, no. So it's really so. I mean, it's actually but the Rudd government. I mean, I thought that the second package was completely ludicrous. But of course, it's politics, and I think it kind of worked. I mean, the government, you know, saved Australia, saved the country from crisis. And of course it's true, though. I mean, the Australian economy sailed on pretty well. I mean, I think without that extra package, without having borrowed all that money and built all that rubbish, you know, sure, maybe unemployment might have gone up slightly more. But then it would have come down and we wouldn't have $44 billion worth of debt at 6% per annum. And yeah, we wouldn't have those school halls, but I mean, I don't know whether we'd be that much worse off. I mean, it all depends on whether you believe in Keynesian economics or not, and I don't. I think it's rubbish. But of course, the majority view is that it's very sound and sensible, even though it was a complete fallacy until the 1930s. And people laughed at. You know, the very brightest people would laugh at anyone who said that your government borrowing and spending would improve growth. But now, of course, everyone believes it. The IMF believes it, the World Bank believes it, all European governments, they want more borrowing, and more, they want to end austerity. It's such a joke. Anyway.
But now that they've got all the school boards built, they need to find different projects, and I think the latest education project in Australia is called not building the education revolution, but it's called the education crusade.
That's right, that's what I'm saying. Well, that's right. Well, I mentioned more funding on schools earlier, and that is another new, well, it's called a crusade. So basically, the Gillard government wants a crusade to spend more on schools, and another $5.5 billion a year, which is a lot. Of course, there's no mention of where the money is coming from, because, as I say, revenue is actually already starting to fall away. But anyway, we're going to have a crusade, so it'll probably happen.
Right. Look.
Well, it seems I'm in the fortunate position of having an Australian fiance, but
that's right. I have to have some kids who get all that.
Well, that's great for me. But I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about. I understand Tony Abbott, the leader of the opposition's got a paid parental leave scheme planned. I was wondering if you could tell us about that, and then just make a few more general comments about what the Conservative opposition is, I suppose, proposing in the. Coming up to the next election.
Yeah, so the country now has a paid parental leave scheme, which the Labor government brought in, I think, maybe a year ago. But it's a fairly modest scheme. Basically, it pays the woman, I think, 6 months the minimum wage. So it's not lead. But Tony Abbott was very angry with that scheme. He said it wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough for Australian women. They needed more support. It's all about supporting families, working families. And indeed, so the opposition has had on the books since early 2010. It was announced on Women's Day. I remember that. It was announced on Women's Day. It was the International Year of the Woman, or whatever it is. In early 2010, Tony announced this incredibly generous paid parental leave scheme, which actually the opposition couldn't even believe at the time. I mean, he was the leader then, so everyone had to support it. It's still deeply hated by almost everyone in the opposition, but it is one of his core pledges. Right? It's one of the blood oaths. There's a few blood oaths. That's one of them. So basically, it entails paying women full salary for 6 months, or maybe it's 9 months between.
Is it 18?
Can't be that. It's more than 6 months. Full salary. So a full salary up to 150,000. So, and it's going to be paid for by increasing company tax, but only on big companies. So big companies, I think, with turnover more than 5 million a year, which is actually, I mean, if it's turnover, that's actually not that big. But so their company tax is going to go from 30 to 31.5%. And this is during this whole worldwide push to lower company tax rates. There's recommendations all over the place. 30 to 31.5% to pay for the PBL scheme that's known in Australia. So look, and so more generally on the opposition, I mean, there aren't that many policies from the opposition. I mean, that is one. The others are to get rid of the carbon tax. That is overwhelmingly the largest one. That's another blood oath. So really the opposition is going to have to do it. Because, I mean, Tony's made it very, very clear that they are. To the point where he said that they'll have a government solution if they win the election and then they can't get the legislation through the Senate, they'll actually have another election straight away. He's already said that. So that creates all sorts of interesting possibilities. Look, I mean, Tony's a great guy. I mean, I work for him. He's a really lovely man, but he's not really a small government guy, I don't think. And so a lot of the stuff I mentioned before, the welfare stuff, I don't think much of that's going to be cut back. Indeed, on the contrary, I'd probably expect something to be increased. So anyway.
Now you've talked about basically every madness in Australia except for one, the housing market. What's happening to Australian houses? The Economist, I think, believes they're 40% overvalued, but you still have demand side measures, first-time buyer grant and so on.
Yep.
What's happening on that front?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting in Australia. I mean, I just spoke to a man called William White, who was head of the BIS's economics team for a long time, and now he's at the OECD, he's the chairman of the Economic Review Committee or something. So a really senior guy, and we talked a bit about Australia's house price. He said, it really surprises me that no one worries about it much in Australia. Because I was explaining to him how we have quite high house prices and very high private debt. But in Australia, the house price issue, I mean, the official view of the Treasury and Reserve Bank is that they're not too high, they're fine, and that's kind of all they say about it. Whereas, of course, as you point out, the Economist magazine and various other institutions, and including the IMF, they all say that they are too high and that there's a bubble. There's just a strange tension in Australia with, I mean, we say housing affordability, and that's what politicians want, but they don't want house prices to go down. They want more housing affordability, but they don't want lower house prices. Obviously, it's kind of absurd, right? So yeah, we still have demand supports. I think we've had these for more than 10 years now. These are basic cash grants to people who are buying a home. I think all the economic evidence has shown that it just gets capitalised into the house price, and indeed it's been actually part of Kevin Rudd's proposal back in late 08. Actually, part of that stimulus was to triple the first homeowners grant from $7,000 to $21,000, and just for 6 months, you know. And so, of course, all these unthinking people, they all piled into the market. There was a huge increase in home purchase, and of course, house prices shot up straight away. And then, of course, when it was withdrawn, the house prices fell down, and all those people, they borrowed more than they needed to. So, I mean, these demand things are a real cancer. And on the supply side, it's really an issue for state governments. It's not an issue for the Commonwealth government. I mean, the state governments have enormous influence in Australia, and they control all land policies, all of them, all the height restrictions and all stuff like that. It's all state government. And yet the public and the media focus on what the Commonwealth government can do about housing affordability, which is basically nothing. They can't do anything about it. But unfortunately, people pander to them, and of course politicians go, oh, we'll give you some money, but it just, it just costs money. It costs taxpayers money, and it just increases the price of houses. So it's a pretty sorry state of affairs.
In New Zealand at the moment, we're having a relatively intense debate about the partial privatisation of some of our state-owned enterprises. But over in Australia, there seems to be wholesale asset sales, right across the board. What's the kind of feeling in Australia about that at the moment? Is there the same level of opposition to what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not across this as much as I should be, but most state governments have sold off their kind of power generating assets, except in New South Wales, as far as I know, which is kind of not wanting to do it. You wouldn't do it, but it's there. I mean, I think the community is. From what I know about New Zealand is, I think Australians are more okay with selling off assets than New Zealanders are. It seems, because I know there's this drama at the moment with the 4 power generators and the water and the Maoris and all that sort of stuff, and there's a lot of controversy about it. So in Australia, I don't think people really care that much. Basically, there's not that much left to sell. I mean, the Commonwealth government only own, they still own Australia Post. They own a private health insurer, which is very bizarre. But the opposition has promised to sell that. And I'm sure they will.
How about
It's private health insurance, state-owned is probably public, isn't it?
Sorry, it's public now. Yeah. But it will be private. So that's going to be sold almost for certain, I would say, and that really only leaves the post office and the Australian Submarine Corporation, which builds Collins class submarines. That's a whole other story. That's a whole other story. But yeah, we do have the Australian Submarine Corporation.
And Telstra is still a future fund, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So Telstra was sold off in various tranches in the 90s and the early 2000s. It was all given to the Future Fund, and they've progressively sold down their share. But now there is this new potential state-owned company called National Broadband Network, which I'm not fully across, but certainly it may in 10, 20 years' time when the NBN is finished, if it's even finished by then, be another new kind of state behemoth. So anyway.
Just if we can just take it back to housing, our productivity commission, I'm conscious that there's someone in the room that helped draft that, so I'm sure I'll be corrected if I misrepresent it. But the New Zealand Productivity Commission concluded that by and large, the reason why we have such overvalued housing is because of the supply of land. I just wonder whether, mindful of your comments about the demand side, you can talk briefly about the supply side and whether that's also because of planning regulations or state red tape, whether that's a problem in Australia as well.
Well, I actually don't. I mean, the supply of land is obviously a factor, but I actually don't think it's the main factor in Australia. I mean, I can't say that I'm an expert in this, but the Reserve Bank recently did a research paper about 3 or 4 months ago, and they basically concluded that it was height restriction. It wasn't the supply of land. It was more the height restrictions and zoning, which is actually far more complicated, far less easy to encapsulate in sound bites to explain it to people. Because everyone's just like, oh yeah, release more land. But I mean, the fact is, Sydney's very big already. I mean, it's as big as London geographically, with about 1/3 the number of people in it. I mean, Sydney's Australia's biggest city, but I mean, anyone coming from New York or London, I think, is struck by the low levels of density in Sydney. I mean, even in the eastern suburbs where I live, the inner east, I mean, it is the densest part of Australia. But there's only two high-rise buildings in the area, and everything else is kind of maximum 3 stories. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Whereas most of Paris and London, is about 7 or 8 stories, kind of all over the place. So I really
Because
think
of your
it's...
earthquakes.
Sorry?
Because of your earthquakes.
Well, I mean, maybe, but I just think it's mainly height restrictions and just extremely poor zoning. I mean, I think overnight, I think this Reserve Bank paper said that if you increased the zoning availability by 1 story across the whole city, just by 1 story, you'd lower house prices by 15%, just like that. So it just goes to show how, you know, really, the housing market's not a real market. I don't think it's a creation of government. It's a very, very arbitrary market, and I think its prices are subject almost entirely to what the government does.
Just on that, Oliver, you've got a German background, and I understand that real house prices in Germany haven't done anything for 20 years. What are the height restrictions in Germany?
I think the reason why house prices in Germany have been relatively stable is because you have better incentives for local government to build more and to really follow price signals and follow demand. Because the incentives were such that when you are local government in Germany, you had incentives to actually just build because you could capture some of the extra tax revenue generated by the extra inhabitants. So you would actually capture a bit of income tax paid, and then you make it possible for local government units to accommodate some of the growth, whether it is by releasing more land or adding some extra height. So I think that's the reason. And house prices have been stable in Germany for really decades, at least going back to the 1970s, although in the last few years they've actually had a bit of an upward pressure, but that's just because of the euro crisis, because people are trying to put their money somewhere where it's safe. And it's certainly not in money, but in real estate. And that's why you can see now an upward trend, especially in the big cities like Berlin, because that's where the smart money goes, but it's got nothing to do with planning restrictions, it's just trying to find a safe haven.
If the China boom, you know, stutters and then carries on onwards and upwards, so therefore the mineral sector boom carries on in Australia, what does that mean going forward?
Well, I mean, it just means Australia continues to be very lucky. I mean, I've spoken to currency strategists who expect the Australian dollar to go to $1.50, $1.60. I mean, at some point, and you know, from private discussions with the RBA, at some point they will have to do something. Like it does reach a point, like it did in Switzerland, that was far more dramatic. Huge appreciation that risks wiping out most kind of domestic industry, basically just gets so high in terms of the export industry. I mean, hopefully it doesn't reach that level, because I guess that, you know, does create a problem. Yeah, I mean, I guess it'll trigger wage inflation. You know, we have a re-regulated labour market in Australia, and there's still some scope for wage agreements in Western Australia to filter through the rest of the country. We've only had a new industrial relations system since the 1st of July last year, so it's still relatively new. Unions are still getting used to it and what it means. There has been a little uptick in industrial action in Australia since the Fair Work Act came in, mainly among the public sector unions. And in fact, at the moment, we've got quite big strikes both in Queensland and in Victoria by teachers and state public servants who are angry that their wage rises are not what they were used to basically for 10 years. Look, I mean, it'd be great news if it continues. And look, I mean, realistically, I mean, all the evidence seems to suggest it is going to continue for at least 4 or 5 years. So that's a long time, I suppose. It's certainly enough for for another cycle of wasteful spending by the next month. When that's over, I mean, I think the revenue is going to recede a lot, and there'll be extremely painful decisions. You know, Australia's currency might suddenly fall, or who knows. And you know, China's still very precarious. I mean, there's all sorts of internal dissent over there, you know, people disappearing, and you know, I think they're going to find it harder to hold the country together in a dictatorship. I mean, it's like a market dictatorship, and it seems to be working. But I mean, you'd think that as the country becomes richer, its private citizens are going to want to formalise some sort of arrangement that the government cannot arbitrarily take, you know, basically put them in prison or whatever, which is still the case. Of course, it doesn't happen very much anymore, but it still can happen. And so I imagine there'll be some sort of internal problem which, you know, might lead to an economic, some sort of hiatus for a few years, which will have effects on Australia.
In the light of your concerns about Australia, do you think compulsory superannuation is a good idea, and especially given the home bias of Australian funds?
No, I think it's a disastrous idea. Superannuation. This is a minority view. Both sides of politics sing its praises, compulsory superannuation. In fact, I was extremely disappointed this year, or maybe late last year, that the Liberal Party decided to agree to the increase in the superannuation guarantee from 9% to 12%. I thought that was just absolutely outrageous, because I mean, it's from a political sense, it's a fantastic policy because people don't see it that it's their own money, right? Because workers don't actually cut your wages when it goes up. It's just an impost on the employer, right? They just have to pay a bit more. Even though the economics of the matter is very clear, is that in the long run, it is just lower take-home wages, basically. And so, of course, you've got ordinary people, people on very low incomes, 9% of their wages are soon to be are kind of siphoned out into these accounts that the banks manage, basically, and they're rorted left, right and centre with the high fees over very, very many years. I mean, the average fee is 106 basis points a year, I think. So that is, that's, your assets being clipped by over 1% every year for 40 years. Of course, the financial service sector in Australia is salivating at this increase from 2012. It's basically going to increase their torrent of fees by a third, right? And it's, I just find it really disgusting, and I think all the evidence that people don't save enough and all this sort of thing, I just find it all very dubious, and I think that people don't save because they already know there's a pension. Like, there's already an old age pension. And they have all these little cameos in the Henry Review about the person earning X, working for X, working for Y, and he doesn't save enough. But I mean, everyone's situation is different. I mean, every single individual in society has a different situation. They might have a wealthy uncle, or they might rely on their children, or they may not work for a while, but or they may be fully conscious that they don't want to have a great deal of money in retirement because they won't be spending as much then, or whatever. Of course, they save in their house. They just choose to improve their house. I mean, I just think that the assumption of super is that people are really stupid, and that is the underlying assumption of it. And I think it also makes people forget about the need to save. So like, oh yeah, there's super, we don't need to save, so they just don't think about it. So it just makes the situation even worse. But honestly, the main reason I hate it is because it subsidises the finance sector, because there's a huge amount of money to spend on all these asset managers and all these highly paid, wasteful people who then go around and say it's a market for talent and they're all great and all this stuff. Oh, it just makes me so angry. So I used to work in finance and I just know what all these people are like. It's really upsetting me that it's all off the back of this compulsory thing that basically sucks money from poorer people and gives it to rich people, and then it's sold as a good thing for poor people. Really upsets me. Anyway.
Right. I think if we don't have any further questions, and of course we don't have any people from the financial sector in the room tonight, and if so, you were not meant. Thank you very much, Adam, for entertaining and enlightening talk on Australia, and I think we'll have now time for more informal discussion over drinks. So would you please join me in thanking Adam Creighton.